Matthew Chase was a 22-year-old man from the Los Angeles area who disappeared in June 1988 after leaving his residence to make a late-night visit to a bank. On the evening of his disappearance, Chase left his home to deposit his paycheck and conduct banking transactions, according to bank records and surveillance footage. The bank's records showed that on the night he left, he made multiple attempts at withdrawals and balance inquiries. When investigators later reviewed the branch's surveillance video, they noted that during one of these ATM transactions, an unknown man was visible standing unusually close behind Chase, appearing to be overseeing his activity. Law enforcement viewed this unexpected presence in the video as a possible indication that Chase may not have been acting entirely of his own volition at that moment. Chase's roommates became concerned when he did not return home after his trip to the bank. They first tried to contact him directly, and when they were unable to reach him, they called the bank posing as Chase in an attempt to determine whether he had used his bank card earlier that night. The bank informed them that his card had been used multiple times that evening, including a deposit and several attempted withdrawals. These transactions suggested that Chase was at the bank making legitimate banking activities before his disappearance. Following the unsuccessful withdrawals and observations from the ATM camera, law enforcement initiated a missing person investigation. Officers canvassed the area where Chase was last seen and collected information about his last known movements. As part of the investigation, detectives interviewed the people close to him, including friends and those who had interacted with him on the night he vanished. Some individuals recalled seeing him at a local shelter where he occasionally went for meals prior to his disappearance. These accounts indicated that Chase was tall, thin, and lanky, and that he was a recognizable figure to some of the volunteers and staff who worked at the shelter. Approximately 3 weeks after Chase disappeared, on June 27, 1988, investigators located the vehicle he had been driving at the time he vanished. The car was found abandoned in the general area where he was last seen before leaving for the bank. Officers ran the vehicle's license plate and confirmed it was linked to a missing person. Standard procedures were followed, including holding the vehicle for further forensic examination. The car was dusted for fingerprints and checked for traces of evidence, but investigators found no identifiable fingerprints or significant forensic clues inside the vehicle. This absence of prints was considered unusual by law enforcement because drivers typically leave some traces of their presence through fingerprints or other physical evidence. Inside the vehicle, detectives found a blue bandana with distinctive letters printed on it. The bandana did not belong to Chase or to his roommate, and investigators considered it a relevant clue that might have been left by another individual who was present at some point prior to or during the time the car was abandoned. At the time, without additional evidence or a direct link to a suspect, investigators were unable to draw definitive conclusions from the bandana alone. The lack of forensic material in the car prevented them from establishing whether Chase had been forced from the car, whether he left voluntarily, or whether someone else had been involved in his disappearance. Throughout the weeks that followed, Chase's family and friends continued to seek answers. Posters featuring his photo were shared in public places, including at the Midnight Mission, a local rescue mission where some volunteers reported recognizing his face from the driver's license photo. These sightings offered temporary hope that Chase might still be alive and possibly in need of assistance. Despite these reports, they did not lead to a definitive sighting or direct evidence of Chase's whereabouts. Law enforcement continued to investigate Chase's disappearance as a missing person case with possible foul play. Due to the circumstances of his last known movements, the presence of the unknown man on the bank's security footage, and the discovery of his abandoned car with no usable prints, police considered the possibility that Chase had been abducted during or shortly after his visit to the bank. As part of their assessment, detectives evaluated the theory that Chase may have attempted to signal distress by entering erroneous amounts during his banking transactions, possibly hoping that repeated failures would alert someone or prompt security intervention. However, this remained a theory rather than a substantiated component of the investigation. On September 17, 1988, nearly 3 months after his disappearance, human remains were discovered in a ravine in Pasadena, California. The remains were eventually determined to be those of Matthew Chase. Due to challenges with identifying the body, including difficulties in matching dental records, the positive identification was delayed. Investigators concluded that he had died from a gunshot wound, classifying his case as a homicide. The placement of his remains in a ravine suggested that his body had been transported and disposed of there after his death. With the discovery of his remains and the determination of a gunshot wound as the cause of death, the case transitioned from a missing person investigation to a homicide investigation. Law enforcement reviewed the circumstances of his disappearance in conjunction with the physical evidence obtained from the site where his body was found. The investigators also re-evaluated the surveillance video from the bank and the blue bandana found in Chase's abandoned car as possible connections to whoever was responsible for his death. Although these items provided leads, there was not sufficient evidence at that time to make an arrest or secure charges against a specific individual or group of individuals. Throughout the subsequent years, the LAPD continued to re-evaluate the case with the available evidence and any new information that surfaced. In 2018, the LAPD officially cleared the case, indicating that they were reasonably confident that the primary suspect was David Bear Meza, a known gang member in the Los Angeles area. While Meza was not alive to be charged or tried, official reports state that he was killed in a drive-by shooting on June 10, 1988, less than 2 days after Chase's disappearance. The department's conclusion was based on circumstantial evidence linking him to the crime. Law enforcement noted that Meza's girlfriend identified him as the man standing behind Chase in the bank camera footage, and other elements of the evidence suggested gang-related involvement. Although police regarded Meza as the individual most likely responsible for Chase's murder, the investigation acknowledged the possibility of accomplices or additional individuals who may have been involved. Without Meza alive to be interviewed or stand trial, and with limited direct forensic evidence tying him to the murder scene beyond the surveillance images and circumstantial elements, the case remained officially closed with that identification. The decision to classify the case as cleared did not involve a prosecution or conviction, as Meza's death precluded the traditional legal process. Chase's family continued to engage with the case over the decades following his death, holding on to hopes for clarity and justice, even as investigators updated them on developments. His case has been featured in cold case documentaries and crime series, highlighting the challenges investigators faced, especially in an era when access to advanced forensic tools like DNA profiling was more limited than in later years. The combination of surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and circumstantial connections formed the basis for law enforcement's eventual conclusion about what likely happened to him on the night he disappeared. Matthew Chase was 22 years old when he left to make a routine banking transaction and never returned. His disappearance prompted an extended investigation that included missing person protocols, forensic assessments, public appeals, and eventual recovery of his remains. Nearly 30 decades later, law enforcement named a likely perpetrator based on the evidence available, even though that person could not be brought to justice in a court of law. Throughout the years, the case cast a spotlight on the complexities of cold cases and the interplay between investigative persistence and the limitations posed by available evidence.
Shi Xiaorong was a young woman from Miang County in Hunan Province, China, who was officially declared missing in March 1987 after she failed to return home and could not be contacted by her family. At that time, local authorities began to treat her disappearance as a missing person case. Shortly afterward, in April 1987, a dismembered body was discovered in the Mayang River by local residents. The remains were found wrapped in material and cut into pieces, and authorities quickly assumed that the body belonged to the missing Shi Xiaorong. The case was initially classified as a homicide based on the discovery of the remains and the timing of her disappearance. Police identified the butcher Tang Xingshan as a suspect in the case. Investigators reported that the dismemberment of the body appeared to be executed in a manner they described as very professional, and they concluded that someone with butchering skills, such as Tang, was likely responsible for the violence inflicted on the remains. According to official accounts from the time, authorities established a narrative that Shi and Tang had a personal relationship, that Shi had allegedly stolen money from him, and that this dispute had led to her murder. Based on this theory, police interrogated Tang and obtained a confession, which, according to contemporary court records, was described as voluntary and consistent with police evidence. Tang was arrested and charged with the rape, robbery, and murder of Shi Xiaorong. During legal proceedings in the late 1980s, the confession and perceived forensic links between Tang and the dismembered body were presented to the court. At that time, Chinese criminal procedure placed considerable weight on confessions, and authorities reported that Tang's admission of guilt conformed to scientific inspection and identification, referring to examinations that were understood at the time to support identification of the remains as Shi and the circumstances of her death. In January 1989, after conviction in the Huaihua Intermediate People's Court, Tang was executed by a single gunshot. He maintained his innocence up until his execution and protested that he had not committed the crime for which he was convicted. Tang's family later reported that he had consistently denied involvement in Shi's disappearance and death, asserting that he did not know her and had no connection to the case. Following Tang's execution, official records in Hunan province treated the case as closed. For many years, the murder of Shi Xiaorong and Tang's conviction remained part of local criminal history. The body that had been discovered was never publicly re-examined using new forensic methods, and no further legal action was taken regarding the case at that time. In 1993, 6 years after Tang's execution, Shi Xiaorong unexpectedly returned to her home village in Guizhou province, where her family lived. She had been alive and living away from her hometown during the entire period when authorities had assumed she was dead. Upon her return, she told her family and community that she had not been killed, but had been deceived and sold into marriage in Shandong province in early 1987, shortly before her disappearance was reported. According to her account, she was taken by people involved in trafficking and ended up married to another man in Shandong. She later lived in Guizhou with her husband. Shi's reappearance was confirmed by family members, and her presence in Guizhou was eventually verified by officials. Reports indicate that at the time of her return, she was later detained in Guizhou on unrelated charges and was serving a drug-related sentence. Despite her legal troubles in Guizhou, she insisted that during the period in which her body was presumed dead, she had not died, had never met Tang, and did not know him. She maintained that she had been taken from her home village and sold into a forced marriage in Shandong, and challenged the official narrative that had led to Tang's conviction and execution. After her return, and once Tang's family learned she was still alive, his relatives began to pursue legal action to clear his name. It took several years for the family to gather the resources and pursue litigation because of financial constraints and fear of confronting the legal system. By the early 2000s, Tang's children filed a lawsuit with the Hunan Higher People's Court, seeking to have their father's conviction overturned and declared a miscarriage of justice.
The legal petition argued that Shi's reappearance proved that the evidence used to convict Tang was fundamentally flawed. In the mid-2000s, media reports and legal filings brought attention to the case as an example of a possible wrongful execution. Shi Xiaorong herself spoke publicly and urged judicial authorities to acknowledge the mistake and rectify the case officially. She testified that she had never met Tang and that the official version of events was incorrect. The court eventually acknowledged that Tang's prosecution had been unjust and posthumously exonerated him years after his execution, formally recognizing that the conviction was wrong. The exoneration recognized that the body previously attributed to Shi had not actually been hers, and Tang had no involvement in her disappearance or alleged death. The circumstances that led to the wrongful conviction of Tang Xingsan involved a combination of investigatory assumptions, forensic limitations of the time, and reliance on a confession that may have been obtained under coercive conditions. At the time of the original investigation in the 1980s, DNA analysis was not widely used or used in routine criminal investigations in rural China, and identification of the dismembered body was based on more limited forensic methods and assumptions about timing and missing persons reports. The profession of the suspect and the appearance of the cuts on the remains also influenced investigatory conclusions. Shi Xiaorong's real circumstances, as she later described them, involved being taken from her home village and moved across provincial boundaries. Human trafficking and forced marriages were problems in parts of rural China during that period, and her disappearance fit patterns associated with such trafficking rings. Her return demonstrated that the assumption of her death based solely on the discovery of a dismembered body was incorrect, and it highlighted how missing person cases can result in misidentification without robust forensic confirmation. The legal exoneration of Tang Xingsan occurred decades after his execution, raising questions about procedural safeguards, evidence standards, and the re-examination of cold cases. Shi's testimony and the documented facts that she was alive provided the central basis for overturning the original verdict. Her return prompted legal review and a judicial acknowledgement that a grave error had been made in the original trial, conviction, and execution of Tang. Since the exoneration, there has been public discussion about the broader implications of the case for justice systems, particularly in contexts where investigatory resources are limited and forensic science is underdeveloped. The case of Shi Xiaorong has been cited in discussions about the importance of accurate victim identification, the need for careful forensic investigation, and the risks of over-reliance on confessions, especially when other evidence is circumstantial. Shi's reappearance changed the very foundation of the case. A woman legally declared dead was alive, and a man executed for her murder was proven innocent. The re-evaluation of the case and Tang's exoneration took place years after both critical events, underscoring the complex nature of criminal justice and the enduring impact of cold cases on families, legal systems, and communities. Shi Xiaorong's story remains a significant case in discussions of wrongful convictions and cold case investigations. It illustrates how initial assumptions and investigatory limitations can lead to profound errors, and how the emergence of new information, even years later, can compel legal systems to reassess historical verdicts. Her experience, from disappearance to return, offers a stark example of the importance of thorough evidence verification in criminal investigations.